Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Historically About. And we have a little bit of a pivot in the phrase thinking historically, as you'll see in a moment. So we can say thinking politically, perhaps, about. And today we're going to be exploring the citizen's role in our constitutional democracy. And today with me, I have Dr. Benjamin Gross, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of the General Education Program at Jacksonville State University. And Dr. Gross has been super helpful for me in fine-tuning this question that students are going to engage with. And I'm really excited for him to join me. So thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I would love for students that are listening or watching this to get a sense of you and your scholarship. So if you could talk a little bit about your scholarship as a whole and what drew you to this particular area of political science.
Sure, absolutely. What drew me to it, honestly, was an accident. It was not intended. So I always had been around politics at some level. My dad helped organize curbside recycling as a civic, organization as a kid. I spoke to city council once, like as a 10-year-old, about roundabouts and traffic circles. But politics was always just something that was like, it was just there. My goal was to do physics. I went to school to go study physics. That's what I went to Northern Illinois University to do. And I accidentally took a class called Democracy in America because I was an 18-year-old, know-it-all punk. And I said, a class in democracy, a class on America, this will be an easy A. And we sat around reading Federalist Papers and Tocqueville and Locke and a bunch of other stuff. No, study questions and no glossary and no bolded words. And it gave me a good looking, but got me interested in this whole thing called political philosophy. And so it was a total accident that got me involved in this.
That's pretty funny. So you, as a political philosopher, I think professionally have to think through the question that the students are wrestling with in this unit. And so the question, and I'll read it, it asks students, what does it mean to be a citizen? And what is a citizen's role in a democracy? I would be curious how you would kind of break down those two aspects of the question and what comes to mind when you think of that question. Where do you start to answer this question?
Oh man, I think that's in itself a great starting point because I think there's multiple ways you could start with this. And so I think one thing is that it's great that it's two questions. It's great that we're separating here the questions of what does it mean to be a citizen and what does it mean to be a citizen in democracy? And so one way I might start thinking about it is a citizen is a type of identity, right? A citizen is belonging to a political community. But there's a lot of other communities that I belong to. I was actually decided that's why today I went a little casual and showed my softball community here. The community I belong to, right, on Sundays, on an afternoon, getting some recreation. And that's part of my identity, but it's not a political community. It's a different type of community. And so one way is maybe thinking about, what does it mean to be a member of a firm or a corporation? What does it mean to be a member of a religious faith? What does it mean to be a member of a family? And then what does that mean as also to be a member of a political community? How are these identities similar, but how are these identities maybe different? And do those similarities show ways that these things exist together? Do these differences show ways that maybe these identities are in conflict with each other or just exist in different areas? So I think one way to start thinking about the question of, what does it mean to be a citizen is also thinking, what does it mean to be part of these other identities? And how do those identities relate them back to the political community, which is where the citizen is?
Yeah, and if you kind of roll back from seeing how we fit into the various communities of our lives, and then thinking of this relationship of citizen and government, especially in a democratic government, what comes to mind?
Yeah. No, I think often when we think about like what does it mean to be a democratic citizen, it comes to mind as being part of the government. And so, what does that mean to be
Hmm.
part of the government? Is voting enough to be part of the government? Does that mean that I've become a citizen? Do I have to attend that city council meeting? Does that mean that by attending it, I'm part of it? Do I have to post on my social media who I intend to support in elections? Right, yeah, and so I think these are sort of the questions then about democratic citizenship is okay. Democratic citizenship intends a government of the people, right? Demos, the people. Okay, so we're part of the people, but then what does that mean that I'm part of the government? Does that mean I have to actually become a member of the government at some point? That I actually have to represent my community, or is voting enough to be a citizen? And so I think that's the big question for us as democracy is, what level of engagement makes me a citizen?
But how might maybe competing perspectives of scholars approach that?
Yeah.
What are some of the thresholds that mark our citizenship?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great one. And that's sort of where my research a lot is in. Because I do a lot of research on a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau is famous for writing a work called The Social Contract, which has got a lot of information, a lot of ideas about what citizenship is. And for him, citizenship becomes all encompassing. You are a citizen, and that is your identity. And everything is about your political regime. And so at the end of the day, he talks about, for example, Sparta, right? It's not about what's good for me or what's good for you. It's about what's good for Sparta. And so he has a famous story recounting of a mother, her 5 sons go off to war. The messenger comes back, tells her, "I'm sorry, but all your children have died." And she slams the table and says, "Slave, I do not care what happened to the city." He goes, "Well, Sparta won." And, "Well, then today's a good day. I'll mourn later." That's a really high level of what a citizen is, right? Right? Like that's like even for me, like wow. And so like there's other ideas though, like a much lower threshold, and that's something more of maybe like a liberal idea, where like a citizen is someone who we have liberties by nature, and we're going to give up some of those liberties in exchange for joining a contract together. And therefore, when I join that contract, it also says like, here are the minimal things you're going to have to do to be a member of this thing. And so maybe that is just voting. And
Yeah.
so that's a much lower bar. I think that's a bar that resonates a lot more with many Americans. But that
Yeah.
high bar, like if there are people who are communitarians who really think the idea of like embracing community and being in the community, that ideology, that the former thing from Rousseau and about Sparta, that's actually going to resonate a lot more. So yeah, there are these different competing ideas out there.
Yeah. So an interesting thing about this particular unit, unlike a lot of our units that are kind of bound by historical time and place, this question that students are engaging with isn't, right. It can transcend thousands of years. It can transcend hundreds of cultures, and these you know diverse historical contexts and cultural contexts that relate to how I think of my role in in this case in democracy, but really is a relation to government. So it's kind of a tall ask, but I'm curious, kind of what jumps out to you as a helpful primary source that students can engage with to really think about the citizen's role.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great perspective too, that this is a question that has been asked over and over and over again. And it's not a question that we have necessarily like, here's the answer, and just repeat the answer and you have the answer. And so there's a lot of value in going across time and place and time and space and checking this out. And so, one thing that jumps up to me, like in the American example, is Jane Addams, where one of her works, "Why Women Should Vote," because in that she takes, I think, like a really interesting rhetorical approach to the question of citizenship. she plays up the idea of, okay, society has told us that women have a traditional role. They have to take care of the household and they have to take care of the children. And that's my duty. Well, geez, society has changed. The world has changed. And to do those things, turns out I now need the right to vote for city council and for meat inspector and for the school board. Otherwise, because of modern society, I can't do the duties you say I have. I think that's a really interesting rhetorical argument that she presents. Accept the premises of generally those that were against the idea of enfranchising women, and show how those premises actually lead to the need to enfranchise women. And so it's an interesting way, just in the own American context, which, 1910 seems like a long time ago, but we're talking, just about 115 years ago. It's an interesting way of, okay, let's look at the question of this idea of what I'm supposed to achieve, my ends. And if that's what my ends are, well, geez, the means might have to change. And so what is a citizen? Maybe in some ways constant, but what is a citizen is also changing, because the times are changing, the society is changing, the technology is changing. And so it can't be static. Now, I think Adams is being, a little rhetorical in the argument too. But learning rhetoric is not a bad thing either. And so I think that's a fun example of how to learn some rhetoric with that source.
Yeah. And so she's speaking at a really transitional time in American history, especially as it relates to citizens, the expansion of citizens' rights and responsibilities. We have just a decade after that is the 19th Amendment and universal suffrage for women. And so I'm curious, like, in these transitional moments, both in global history and in U.S. history, is it so much as the definition of citizenship or a citizen changes, or maybe it's just the mechanism in how we express our citizenship? Because I would imagine that in 1910, Adams still feels like a citizen. She maybe feels like a second-class citizen as it relates to her voting status. But I know this is maybe loosely tied to the general question the students are answering. But I'm just kind of curious how we see these transitions.
And I think it's a great question because I think it points to, again, even the situation that Adams finds herself in, because it's only 34, 35 years earlier, Minor v. Happersett, where the court comes down and says, yes, women are citizens in the United States, but citizenship doesn't guarantee you the right to vote. So you have the privileges and immunities of a citizen, but voting is not one of those privileges and immunities. And so citizenship doesn't equal voting. And so you're right. Like, there is this idea that women are citizens, but voting isn't a part of citizenship. And so I think these times of disruption, I think is the phrase we like today, perhaps though we could call it times of turmoil or times of confusion, are actually opportunities for us to think and reflect on definitions. And so I go all the way back to like ancient Greece, right? Like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon, like they are not in a society where like everything is totally defined. We all agree on these things. Like they're in a society of flux. And that's what gives the space to go, well, hey, we've assumed what a citizen is. But maybe that assumption's wrong. Maybe we need to talk more about that to figure out whether we really understand what this word means. And so I think going back to Aristotle in that way, and I think that's what I really love sort of about this, is it just starts with Aristotle, is a great way of going. Aristotle makes this argument that what a citizen means is somebody who engages in the political community. Okay, that's one idea. What does that engagement entail? He says it's the, generally that you get to be ruler and ruled. Is that what we really mean, or is it something else? And so I think the time that Adams finds herself in is sort of like a time where Aristotle finds himself in. where
Yeah.
the definitions are being in question. And because the definitions are in question, we now have the ability to actually use critical thinking to examine multiple opinions on the matter, and have dialogue and conversation with each other. And instead of being afraid about that dialogue actually is an opening for us to hopefully come to a better understanding.
All right. So I had a question that addresses like different perspectives about the citizen's role. I'd like to specify the question a little bit. So sorry for maybe the lack of preparation for that, but as I'm thinking of the unit that students are engaging with, it is rooted in the past more than the present, right? Like it begins with Aristotle. It looks at citizenship's relationship to uh, the diversity of Americans, whether that be ethnicity or gender. Um, but they still kind of fit within this classical liberal idea of citizenship. As I kind of look at the present world, this classical liberalism isn't maybe as prominent as it was, 40, 50 years ago, where the sources kind of stop. So a perspective, I'm curious if you have seen anything or think anything, just what are some big shifts in the relationship of a citizen to its government um, now with competing philosophies. I think the dominance of Western political thought is not as strong in the 21st century, and we're seeing a lot more diversity of political thought as well, making its place and its home in the United States. So, how might students not just read into this idea of citizenship, but experience this idea of citizenship in the 21st century?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. And to experience citizenship, I think one of the things we can do is we can just try to engage, with those around us. So even just talking to our caretakers or talking to our friends and having conversations about, what we think the government should do, or maybe what we think the government should not do, right? Just start
Mm-hmm.
there. What do we think the purpose of a government is? Or what are things that governments should never do? And just having that conversation and listening to each other, and that takes a big amount of
Yeah.
trust that we're actually going to listen to each other, and we may have different opinions, but we're not here to try to say necessarily off that your opinion's right. Like we're here to hear all these opinions to see if there's something in common or if we're pointing to something together. Or I have this opinion, it turns out you can't have both at the same time, so maybe I need to rethink them, right? Like, so I think just starting even there is a way to begin experiencing citizenship. But that's already choosing a form of citizenship that's a democratic
Sure.
form, right? Because we're already talking about with the other people, with our peers, what it means to be a citizen. In a totalitarian state, you're not going to get that opportunity. Right? The state is going to tell you this is what a citizen is, and you do this or you don't do this. And so I think that's one of the cool things too about experiencing citizenship in America. We have the debate about not only what is a good citizen, but we have the debate about like, can the good citizen also be a good human? Where in other regimes, like you're going to be the good citizen, and it turns out the good citizen is not the good human. Mussolini's Italy has a definition of what the good citizen is. And it's generally not one that many people also think makes you a good human being. And so there's a bigger debate, I think, that happens for us about citizenship too, is we're debating at times about good citizen, good human, and are those things in harmony with each other? Or by being the good citizen, am I actually going to have to be the bad human being? And if that comes up, what do I make the choice to do? Do I choose to be the good human at that point and be the bad American? Or do I make the choice to be the good American and be the bad human?
That's so there. I'm thinking a lot, and I honestly didn't think of that uh, juxtaposition of good citizen versus good human initially. In your feedback, as we kind of dove into the unit, illuminated that more for me. And so, I think of Martin Luther King Jr. kind of standing up in the civil rights movement. acknowledging that it was the right thing to disobey unjust laws. And so but I also kind of think he made the case that that was him being a good citizen too, and that the government just was slow to catch up on what was meant by a good citizen. And so the reason I bring that up,
I think you're right.
In American democracy, I think regardless of where you stand, you assume that the goal is that those two things are the same. And so, to use MLK again, he called the Declaration of Independence a promissory note. And it was the ideals that we needed to live up to that we weren't. Or I think of, there's a historian, he's at Wheaton College, and he wrote a book called We the Fallen People. His name's Robert Tracy McKenzie. And the same idea, just acknowledging, there's these ideals of citizenship, and the story of American history is us consistently failing to, but attempting to live up to these ideals. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about what makes Mussolini's Italy different than that? Why is it, or maybe am I misunderstanding American citizenship?
No. I think you got it right. I think because again, I think it goes back to that classical liberal thing. I think Keene with the letter from Birmingham jail, right, is trying, and other of course work, but is trying there specifically to show look, there is divine law and there is natural law, and it turns out these things are in coherence with each other. And so when I break man's law, I'm breaking man's law because it's deviated from what nature and the divine has taught us. And we are just trying to live up to what the Declaration has promised. And that's in coherence with divine law. And so I think for the classical liberal, like King's grabbing on there, it makes sense that you can be a good American and you can be a good human. We go to someone like Mussolini, right? Mussolini, I guess technically it wasn't him. He gets credit for the work for the fundamental ideas. That's actually by Gentile, who is sort of the philosopher of fascism in Italy. But Mussolini and him, are working together. But in fundamental ideas, Mussolini lays out that there is nothing but the state, right? There is no individualism. There is no individual good. The only thing that can overcome death is the state, and therefore all actions must be taken through the state because that's the determinant of all morality. And that's where I think King disagrees. No, the state isn't the determinant of all morality. There is something, and that's the beauty of the Declaration, because it's not saying morality is determined by these people writing this document. Morality exists outside of the government. It exists in nature.
Yeah, the citizen is endowed.
And I think to your point,
prior to the government, right?
Yeah.
It's just the government's job to secure whatever those rights are.
Absolutely. And I think that's sort of what you're bringing about earlier too, some of these more philosophic shifts, maybe postmodernism. If nature doesn't give us a guide, like a classical liberal would argue, right? Or an ancient would argue, or a medieval would argue. If nature doesn't give us a guide for how this is how we should live, if all meta narratives are false, if all grand narratives do not exist, well, geez, then what is my guide to be a good human? It really does seem to just come down to different arguments, for better word, of citizenship, and you choose the one that you want. And so there is a battle there that I think a lot of American history and American ideals have argued no. There is an ability to do both. And Aristotle, by the way, did say that there was an ability to do both. There was an ability to be a good human and a good citizen. It just was very unlikely.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand. So Aristotle said that it was unlikely to be a good human and a good citizen. Where my understanding...
not impossible.
My understanding of the way the founders framed the Declaration how the Constitution is able to be amended, these checks and balances in government, is that the goal is to get those two as close as possible on a consistent basis. So would that be a departure from kind of Aristotle's belief in that?
Yeah, no, I think the founding is a departure from Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle makes an argument that human nature is this really high idea that we're trying to achieve, and it's probable that most of us will never achieve it. Also, because just chance, like there's just you need leisure to go study to become a virtuous person, and it just turns out most of us just don't have leisure, and that's not because of anything wrong that you did. It's just you weren't born with those circumstances, and that's unfortunate. I think America and modern thought tries to lower the bar a bit and says, it's not about trying to achieve some end of the race or some end goal. Like nature's there initially, and so since nature's there initially, like the whole universe is around us here initially, right? It's not that we have to try to achieve something. It's just about preserving that nature and securing that nature. And so maybe there are things in the real world that make that nature insecure, like starvation, right? If we have a lack of food, if we have a lack of resources, maybe we can't live up and be good citizens because we're just focused on trying to get whatever we can, and we'll take from whoever we can take because we want to survive. So how do we solve the problem of scarcity so that's not an issue? And if we can remove scarcity as being an issue, then we can free ourselves to live up to that initial nature that allows us to both be a good human and then a good member of this political community.
That's really helpful. Sorry, students, maybe I feel like I'm learning right now too, kind of the intersection of the like ancient philosophy, and then modern American classical liberal postmodern experiences. Like I'm making all these connections in my head and trying to understand it a little bit better.
Well, and I think what's really great then about like what the students here are reading, is they're really grappling with these questions again, just coming back sort of to the concrete of like, what does it mean to be a citizen in American democracy? And we focus a lot on like voting. So like, does being a citizen mean that I have the right to vote and that I exercise the right to vote? Or does being a citizen mean I have the right to vote, and even if I don't exercise it because I choose, the protest, or I just am busy on a Tuesday, I'm still a citizen? Or does being a citizen mean something more? Does it mean when I see an unjust law, like King sees, that I have to engage in civil disobedience? Does that make me a full citizen? Douglas, right? When I see those around me, right, not giving the rights that are due to me, is it my job to go out there and speak and share about how these rights that should be given to me at this point? It shouldn't be a fight. They are there in the Constitution. Is it my job as a citizen now to alert others to this problem? And so I think the unit does a really great job of showing across different voices in different times and different places of the country, this grappling of this question of what does it mean to be an American citizen? Is putting that post on social media some slackivism enough to say I'm a citizen? Or do I have to do a little bit more than that?
So and that what you like just said at the social media post, I think is how a lot of us maybe pat ourselves on the shoulders that we are doing our civic duty. Now I know I feel that way. Like I can't be as involved as I would like to be in certain initiatives, but I can post about it, right? And so to me, it's like, well, at least I'm not being silent. I've actually kind of personally toned that back because I realized it was that version of activism was exhausting for me, that I couldn't really keep up with what I wanted to be present about. And so I tried to be a little bit more local in my own citizenship, just the things that are tangible for my family and for my community. And so I'll kind of loosely transition to the last question, given that context. when you have your students think about citizenship, think about the role of citizen, like what are you hoping that students get out of that? What is a goal that you might have for them in engaging with a question like this?
Yeah. No, my hope is that this is an invitation for them to reflect for themselves um, on what is it that they want out of
Mm-hmm.
life. What is the good life for them, and so does that good life have a political element to it, and if it has a element of being a citizen in it, what does that look like? Is that only being a citizen? I think of like The Simpsons here, which of course I have a feeling will be evergreen. It will never go away. But is it like The Simpsons that like when you're upset you march down to the town hall and get mad at Mayor Quimby and you demand that something like, is that just the good citizen? Just when something
Mm-hmm.
bothers me, I go voice what bothers me. Or does being a good citizen mean more than that, or something different than that? But again, like to me, I hope the point of all that question on what is a citizen and what does it mean to be a good citizen, and can being a good citizen make you also a good human? Are those things at odds at times? Like this is just an invitation for each individual to reflect on what do they want out of life, um, and hopefully through reflecting on that, the question has value no matter what the answer is to you, because you have a better understanding for yourself what you want out of life and hopefully why you want it too.
Yeah, and I almost think that like more than any sort of action, the ability to answer those questions is what I think of when I think of like an engaged citizenry or an active citizenry. Is that we feel maybe not even confident, but willing to think through those questions for ourselves and engage with them.
Yeah, and my hope too then is like you're willing to find others who are earnest and honest and brave that will engage with you too. And again, at the end of the day, we may not agree, but I may understand you better, and you may understand me better, and I may understand
Yeah.
myself better because there are things now that I've discovered that I hadn't seen before. And I know that's a really high ideal of a citizen. It really is. Because again, as you point out, like, and I know our students don't think about it, but there's a sweet spot there probably where you have very little responsibilities and a lot of free time. But suddenly life gets really busy with career or with family or with other things, and it becomes really hard to get involved in
Yeah.
those ways. Um, but it doesn't mean that at least you don't have the skills there, so that maybe when the time is needed and where the necessity shows up, like I have to do this, it's not just optional. I think of like going back to again, old movie Karate Kid. You've painted the fence, you've waxed the car, and so when you need those skills, you can do the karate when
Mm-hmm.
necessary. And to some level, that's the practice of citizenship. Maybe we always, especially in democracy, don't need to be the active citizen, but when called upon, we can be the active
Yeah.
citizen.
I think that's a one. I think that's like a very helpful way to think about citizenship that's kind of based in reality rather than constantly pushing for the ideals. And two, I think that's a perfect way to end. Dr. Benjamin Gross, I really appreciate the thoughtful dialogue and the engaging answers to these questions. I'm grateful for your scholarship and your help for the students who are engaging with this unit.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I wish everyone the best as they go examine this for themselves and hopefully come to understand themselves better through it.